William from Exploding Word Ministries, and we're continuing with our Bible study of the book of Gospel of Mark, and we're continuing with chapter 3. Around this time, when he had went into the synagogue, and a man with a swiveled hand was there, and some of them were looking for reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Now Jesus said to the man with the swiveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." We need to understand what's happening here. Remember earlier we had mentioned the fact that Jesus was being challenged on blaspheming because he had healed sin. At another time, he was challenged because he claims to be Lord even of the Sabbath. So we see here a reality that the Pharisees and the leaders of the law want to find out just how different a preacher Jesus really is, and what that's going to mean to them, and how it's going to affect them. So when they see this man with the shriveled hand on the Sabbath in the synagogue, they want to see what Jesus is going to do, because they have determined that if he decides to go and heal this man, this would be the equivalent of Jesus undertaking to do a job of work on the Sabbath. And if that was the case, he would not be considered righteous or godly, and therefore they could accuse him of blasphemy. So Jesus becomes aware of them, what they're thinking, and so he says to them a question. It's a very simple question. Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath, or to do evil? To save a life, or to kill? But you know what? They didn't respond. Now, Mark is very quick to tell us something here. He tells us that Jesus became angry at this point. He became upset, greatly distressed at the stubbornness of their hearts. And so he tells the man, "Stretch out your hand." And the moment the man stretched out his hand, it was made completely restored. There was not anything wrong with it. So the Pharisees went out, and with the Herodians, who were the disciples of Herod, or the followers of Herod, plotted how they might kill Jesus. So let's examine that for a moment. Let's look at what's happening here. Why would Jesus have got angry because they were quiet? I mean, they were quiet before, he never got angry. So why has he suddenly become angry? What's going on here? Well, do you remember what Jesus asked them? He said to them, "Is it right to do good or to do evil? To save a life or to kill?" Now, God is love. God's outgoing concern for others is recorded throughout the law. It's part and parcel of why the Sabbath exists. Because of God's love for man, he determined there was a time when they needed to have a period which they could rest and recuperate from their work, and also have time to think and consider him, especially in some of the work conditions that would have existed throughout that 6,000 year period which we have experienced since creation. But there's more than that. What Jesus was picking up here is that when they didn't answer what they actually were saying to themselves in their own hearts, in their own mind, not recorded here, but by their actions noted here, is, yeah, it would be better not to heal on the Sabbath. Yeah, it would be better to allow someone to die rather than break the Sabbath. Yeah, it would be better to permit evil to continue if it meant having to address it on the Sabbath. That was their attitude. That was what they were coming across with. And it was that total rejection and opposition to what God actually stands for that Jesus was so angry about, because he has a zeal for the honor of God and for the law. He has a zeal of truth and righteousness. But they don't. And they didn't understand that they were actually breaking the Sabbath by refusing to consider healing or doing good on it. So we know now that because of Jesus' actions, we have seen him directly coming face to face with both the religious and civil authorities, because the Herodians, as the people of Herod, were actually subject to the Roman rules and regulations, and therefore they looked after the civil law, the law of the governing under the Roman seal. Whereas the Pharisees were only interested in the religious concepts. And as when the two of them are now coming together, they see Jesus as a threat both to civil and to religious understanding within the people. So this is why they've determined he needs to die. But we read from verse 7 onwards that the crowds that were now following Jesus were increasing every day. It got to a stage where Jesus literally went down to the Lake of Galilee, and because he was healing people, other sick people were trying to push themselves forward so that they could touch him, to be made well. And it was a case that he was going to be mobbed. So he had given instruction to his disciples, get a small boat, prepare a small boat for me so that I can go out onto the lake and preach to these people. And so that's what he does here. He actually goes out here, and the people are coming from all of the areas all around as his fame is being broadcast. And think about this. Have you ever heard of a person who is healing? That person, by word of mouth, will be known about within a few days. And this is what was happening with Jesus. The word was spreading. The grapevine of humanity telling people, did you hear about so-and-so? Yeah, do you know the way they were crippled? They're not anymore. Huh? How'd that happen? This guy, Jesus, Nazareth, he did it. He's brilliant. You should see it. I hear he's going over by your town soon. And so on. And before long, it was spreading. People from all over were coming, from all regions. So you see, as he was doing these things, as he was getting this fame, this also was affecting the Pharisees, because they were seeing what they thought was a threat to their way of life, and they didn't realize who Jesus truly was. It was at this time also that Mark begins to explain to us that Jesus is considering now the calling out of the 12 apostles. So he separates himself and heads off to a mountainside. And while in the mountainside, what he does is he starts to give them authority over demons so that they can cast them out. And he calls 12 of them by name, and the names are all recorded here as to what they can do. So they are ones he's going to teach on an individual basis so that they understand more and more about his teachings and how he does things and why he does it. He's going to explain to them. They in turn are going to have disciples now and followers of their own. And each of them will teach their disciples, who in turn will, as the thing goes. And this is how the old principle of discipleship worked, because the older disciples taught the younger disciples. And that's the principle. So Jesus, as the master, teaches from the top down. And that's exactly how the churches work now as well today. Jesus went back, however, into his house, and a crowd would come. And the crowds became so numerous that it got to a stage where Jesus and the disciples didn't even have time to eat. There was a problem. There was a management problem of time here. But the word of this concept, this difficulty, was fed back to the family of Jesus. That's Mary, his mother, and his brothers and sisters. Now, we note that it doesn't mention Joseph. That is because we believe that at this juncture, Joseph already has died. There is no statement in the Bible to support that. It is merely because of his absence. And also, the fact that Jesus was revered as being the head of the family would mean that his father, or earthly father, had already disappeared or died. So that concept has already happened. So his family have heard about this. But when the teachers of the law are examining and listening to the people talking about Jesus and the miracles and all the rest, they have a problem. You see, if they say he's from God, his teaching is so different from what they're teaching, they're literally going to have to change. And they're not prepared to do that because they have the backing of the law, of the traditions, of the customs. They are responsible for maintaining the status quo. And therefore, it's impossible from their point of view that Jesus ultimately could be from God. Even though he's doing all these good things, but how does he have authority to do what he does? So they came up with something. And what they said was, he's obviously possessed by Beelzebub, the prince of the demons, and that's how he's able to drive out demons and heal sickness, because he's simply saying, no, you don't do that yet, away you go. And they're obeying him because they're all meek. Now when Jesus heard them doing this, he gave them a parable. And this is one of the start in Mark where we actually start really getting into the parables here. So we look at this parable and see what Jesus is saying. How can Satan drive out Satan? Jesus asked them. For if a kingdom is divided against itself, it can't stand. If a house is divided against itself, the house can't stand. So if Satan is opposing himself and is divided, how then can he stand? His kingdom will come to an end. In fact, you know yourselves that no one could enter a strong man's house, and Satan is a strong man, and rob him of what he believes is his, unless you first tie up the strong man and prevent him from being able to defend himself. I tell you the truth. Now Jesus is talking directly here to the Pharisees. I tell you the truth. All the sins and blasphemies of men can be forgiven. See, again, we're back into this concept that everything that a man does can be forgiven. But, and this is where Jesus is bringing it across, there is one sin that is not forgivable. And that is the sin against the Holy Spirit of God. For he who is guilty of that sin will never, ever be forgiven. He is guilty of an eternal sin. And he said that because they were saying he had an evil spirit. They weren't looking at what was happening. They were assuming that because Jesus didn't fit what they thought he should have been doing, he didn't fit into their idea of what the Messiah should be like, that he had to have been operating from a demonic presence, which meant that they couldn't define the difference between good and evil. They couldn't tell the difference. Now, as representatives of God, they should have known that when somebody is healed, when demons are cast out, when the sick are restored, when leprosy is cleansed, when the blind are given their sight, when the deaf hear, when those who are bent over are suddenly straightened up, these things are not done by those who would bring torment and pressure into your life. These are not done by the bullies of this world. These are not done by the tormentors. These are only done by the liberators. These are done by the Spirit and presence of the living God who was freeing the captives. But you see, the Pharisees had more in common with Satan than they had with God. And as a result, they didn't recognize the Spirit of God. And therefore, by denying the presence of God in doing good, they were denying the Spirit and literally committing an Because the unpardonable sin, in its simplest terms to understand, is to see good and to call it evil. That is to see and understand that something is for good. That the reasons and the motivations behind someone are good. That the outcome of someone is good, but to call it bad. To know and to deny it. And that's exactly what they were doing with Jesus. But there was another thing. Remember we mentioned that Jesus' family had already been told that this ministry had got off such a start that they weren't even having time to eat. They thought Jesus was imbalanced of the mind. They thought, it's gone to his head, he's gone a wee bit too lally. So they wanted to come and take him home. And that's what Mark is bringing across here. That they want to come and take him home because they think he's gone mad. They've lived with Jesus for 30 years. They have seen him, talked with him, worked with him. And yet when he's out doing the ministry of God, when he's fulfilling the commission that he has been set aside for, they accuse him of being mad. They accuse him of losing it. You understand the principle here? They didn't appreciate who he was. That means that his own brothers and sisters, his own mother, who had known about his miraculous conception, couldn't perceive the truth of who he was. It was so difficult even for her to do that. And as a result of that, they were coming to take him. So when they arrive, the crowd is all around him. And somebody in the crowd said, "Hey, your mother and brothers and sisters, they're outside. They're looking about you." And Jesus looked up and he says something which seems hurtful in a sense. "Who is my mother and my brothers?" Then he looked around those seated in the circle and he says to them, "Here is my mother. Here is my brothers. Whosoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my mother and sister and brother." Because he knew that they didn't know him. That's the end of chapter 3 of Mark. We will be looking more at Jesus' parables and his way of teaching as we go into chapter 4. So, until the next time, God bless.